Oh, I think we can, but I'd be happy to introduce you if you'd like.
Sure.
On behalf of the Plant Conservation Alliance, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Murphy Westwood. As Vice President of Science and Conservation at the Morton Arboretum in Illinois, Dr. Westwood is responsible for planning, strategic direction, program integration, fundraising, and external relations for science and conservation at the Arboretum. She oversees numerous tree programs and initiatives, including scientific research through the Center for Tree Science, improving the health of Chicago's urban forests through the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, leading the Global Conservation Consortium for oak operations to protect threatened tree species through the Global Tree Conservation Program, and supporting the professional development and national and worldwide collaboration through ArbNet, the global interactive community of arboreta and tree-focused professionals. Let's turn it over to you now, Murphy. You have the floor.
Thank you, Carol. And can you see my title slide okay?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay. I'm going off camera and you can come on if you want.
Ooh.
You don't have to. You don't have to, though.
I'm a little worried I'm going to mess everything up if I unshare and turn on camera. So sorry I didn't do that, but I am here.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. So I'm also recovering from a sore throat and a cold. So I have various waters and teas here, and I'm hoping that my voice will see me through this. And yeah, as Carol said, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I can't see the chat, but we'll get to them at the end, and there will be time for Q&A at the end. So I would like to start first by acknowledging that the Morton Arboretum is located on the ancestral homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, and many other tribes that resided on or migrated through this land for generations. Please join me in recognizing these enduring communities and the many Indigenous peoples residing throughout the Chicago region today. We invite you to learn more about them and the Arboretum's commitment to supporting Indigenous peoples at mortonarb.org. And I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the amazing partners that I have had on this US tree assessment project over the last at least 5 years, but probably longer than that. The people listed here and the organizations that have supported this work over the past several years have really been wonderful thought partners and collaborators through this whole process. And actually, it's a lot more than even just this team effort. The project I'm about to tell you about could not have been possible without the contribution of dozens and probably hundreds of tree experts and botanists and conservationists across the country. In fact, some people on this call today helped us out with a lot of these assessments. So this really is a collective effort. So thanks for everybody's support on this. So what are we going to talk about today? I will introduce the Global Tree Assessment Initiative and the motivation behind how that got started. I'll then describe the two key threat assessment platforms that are commonly used in the US today, which is the IUCN Red List of threatened species and NatureServe's conservation status assessments. Then I'm going to describe the process that we went through to create our checklist of US trees for this project. And then we'll go through the results of our US tree assessment effort and some of the trends and the geographic patterns and major sort of outcomes and conclusions from this. And then I'll have a couple of slides about the sort of conclusions and the key messages or takeaways. So if anybody needs to go to sleep, I know these online presentations can sometimes be a little bit boring, hopefully not this one, but wake up for these last two slides. And then there's the taking action, what we can all do to utilize this information and hopefully advance conservation efforts for trees in the US. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So what motivated all of this in the first place? I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I don't have to explain that we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, also known as the sixth mass extinction. And we are losing plant and animal and fungal species around the world at a much higher rate than normal. Many of these species are going extinct before we can even describe them. This is a report that was published in 2020 by the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in the UK, the state of the world's plants and fungi. And this report found that 2 in 5 plants are estimated to be threatened with extinction. So we know that there's a biodiversity crisis, but where do those numbers come from, that 2 in 5 estimated with extinction? And the way that we actually determine that and figure that out is through a systematic process of evaluating the extinction risk of plant and animal species. And the best way to do that is through objective, standardized threat assessment platforms. And in this talk, I'm going to use the term threat assessment and conservation assessment kind of interchangeably. Different frameworks and platforms exist, and they sort of use both of those terms. So forgive me if I use them both in this, but they essentially mean, what is the chance that this species is going to go extinct? And there are many groups of plants in the world many groups of organisms in the world where their risk of extinction is really well known. Trees is not one of them. So birds, mammals, those are very well-studied organisms. Every species has been assessed, in many cases, several times over. Trees, that was not the case. So in about 2015, an initiative was created called the Global Tree Assessment. And the goal for that was to create conservation assessments for all of the world's roughly 60,000 tree species by 2020. And this was spearheaded by the conservation organization, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which is based in the UK at Kew, actually. And they were doing this in partnership with the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Global Tree Specialist Group. And the reason this was basically created was that they realized that when they sort of did the baseline assessment in 2015, they identified that fewer than 10,000 tree species had been assessed for the IUCN Red List of threatened species. And we knew that there were many more tree species than that. So this initiative, this Global Tree Assessment Initiative, was created, and BGCI and this Global Tree Specialist Group sort of coalition motivated dozens of partners. Actually, so far it's been over 60 institutional partners and over 500 tree experts from around the world to rectify this problem that we just did not have a good understanding of how threatened with extinction the world's trees were. And in fact, one of the big products of this effort was the creation of BGCI's Global Tree Search database, which I would encourage everybody to take a look at. So as of 2015, we actually didn't even know how many tree species there were in the world. So BGCI underwent a really big taxonomic study and sort of gathering of all these validly published names and defining what a tree is and creating this database of trees. And that's when, in 2017, they created Global Tree Search and published a great paper. And I have the reference on a future page that you can take a look at. But that's when we sort of figured out, oh, there are 60,000 validly described known tree species in the world, and they're now searchable in this database. So this initiative was underway. It was really exciting. It had these big, ambitious goals. And I was part of some early conversations with a bunch of those partners that were on that previous slide to say, well, what did this look like for US trees? How is the US contributing to this effort? And in the US, it's a little bit complicated because we actually have 2 commonly used standard threat assessment frameworks or platforms in the US, and that is the IUCN Red List as well as the NatureServe Conservation Status Assessment process. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to just lay some groundwork so we're all on the same page about what those 2 things are. So the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species was established in 1964. And at a global scale, it's the most widely recognized threat assessment platform in the world. It's also the assessment platform of choice for the global tree assessment. And that's because it is an objective, standardized system that is applied at the global scale that everybody kind of recognizes, so that we can be comparing, apples to apples, as it were, through this assessment process. Assessments for the Red List are researched and reviewed by a global network of scientists and conservationists. And as of 2015, when the GTA sort of was kicked off and initiated, there were fewer than 300 US tree species on the Red List. And we know there are a lot more US trees than that. So it was actually kind of shocking to see how poorly represented US tree species were on the Red List in 2015, when BGCI and the Global Tree Specialist Group were kicking off this big global tree assessment. Now, we also have NatureServe, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. NatureServe was established in 1978, and it is widely used throughout North America, especially by US, state, and federal agencies for understanding extinction risk at multiple levels within the US and in other countries, in Canada and Mexico as well, and some other parts of North America, and even a bit in Central America. So, but it's not recognized or used largely in other parts of the world. The assessments for NatureServe are researched and reviewed by its NatureServe network of natural heritage programs. And in contrast to the IUCN Red List, in the US, trees are really well represented. So NatureServe had really good data and was really well assessed for trees. Nearly all of the tree species were assessed on NatureServe, but many of the assessments as of 2015 were out of date. So about 97% of tree species had been assigned a global rank in the NatureServe database, NatureServe Explorer. But 75% of the assessments of those ranks were more than 10 years old. And in many threat assessment methodologies, including the Red List and NatureServe, 10 years is really the goal that we have. So if anything's more than 10 years old, we sort of see it as out of date, essentially kind of expiring, and we want to reassess because, as we all know, statuses change. So that's kind of where we were at 2015. Now let's take another look at sort of how to compare these two. So both the Red List and NatureServe use basic demographic and population trend data, as well as threats and things like human uses and exploitation, to categorize species. For the Red List, you can either be, and I'm going to read through these categories from the bottom to the top. So many species are not evaluated if you've never bothered to gather the information and actually apply the process. You would fall into the not evaluated category. There are some species where you try to gather the information that you need to assess, and there just isn't enough. There's not enough information out there, or maybe the taxonomic concept is a little too fuzzy or confusing and not well defined. Those species may end up being classified as data deficient. Then you get into these different categories of threat. From the bottom to the top, they're going in an increasing risk of extinction, from least concern up through near threatened, and then you get into these threatened categories. So this is how Red List defines a threatened species, as either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. You also have extinct in the wild, and a species that would be extinct in the wild might be something that's only grown in cultivation, for example, in a botanic garden or conserved in a seed bank. And then there can be extinct, so totally gone. Now, NatureServe uses very similar data, similar types of demographic information, population trends and threats, and they use a similar approach where they're looking at thresholds. There's a weight of evidence approach to it, and species also get categorized into these different categories, from secure through critically imperiled. And you can do that at the global scale, so you can look at a species across its entire range, whether that's in the US or elsewhere as well. You can do it at the national scale, so an N category, and you can do it at the sub-national scale. And for us in the US, that's usually a state level categorization. At sort of first glance, these categories look like they should be identical, right? Critically endangered is equal to critically imperiled, but that's not exactly the case. The frameworks are just a little bit different enough that there isn't exact like one-to-one correlation. So even looking at the exact same data, something might be assessed as critically endangered on the Red List, but only imperiled on NatureServe. Now that doesn't happen a lot. Usually there's pretty good sort of rough alignment between the categories that are in like really bad shape versus sort of apparently secure. but just so everyone's aware, these aren't sort of identical. So not the same. But another challenge with these two assessments is that there isn't a really efficient or fast way to exchange information between these platforms. So while NatureServe had a lot more information than the IUCN Red List did, it wasn't very easy to kind of extract that information from the NatureServe biotics database. Now, efforts have been made in the last several years, and NatureServe's really, they work closely with IUCN Red List, and you know, that we're sort of chipping away at making that a little bit more streamlined, but we thought that there was an opportunity to continue that work with this project. And so that's why NatureServe has been a core partner on this from the beginning, so that we had both Red List and NatureServe addressed. So we kicked off this US tree assessment project in 2017. And the reason we did that, our goals were to address the lack of US tree species on the IUCN Red List, and to try to remedy some of those out-of-date NatureServe Global Ranks. We also wanted to ensure that the US was contributing to this global tree assessment initiative, and that our trees were being captured in this big, broad, ambitious goal to help bring awareness to trees and to sort of understand where our tree flora stood, you know, in a global context. We also wanted to create an easily accessible checklist of US tree species that could be used for this global tree assessment and for other work as well. And when we sat down to kind of focus on this project, we decided to constrain our geographic scope to the contiguous 48 states. And that's because Hawaii has a really strong conservation network there. They've got their own specialist group, their own IUCN specialist group, and had threat assessments well underway over there. So we didn't include Hawaii. Puerto Rico also has a checklist and assessment program underway with some collaborators. So those sort of two other big biodiversity hotspots for the US, we sort of had their own efforts going on. So we sort of constrained this to the contiguous 48. We also wanted to develop a comprehensive picture of the state of extinction risk for these US trees. What did it look like at a national scale? And we wanted to continue that process of streamlining data sharing between the IUCN Red List and NatureServe, so that people weren't duplicating effort, essentially. So when we sat down to get started on this project, I thought that compiling all these Red List assessments, where we had, you know, so much work to do, hundreds of species to address, was going to be the big task. Turns out that was not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge was creating a checklist of US trees. And let me walk you through this process. Let's start with this question: what is a tree? Now, I'm sure you're all thinking, this lady needs to get a new job. She works in an arboretum and doesn't know what a tree is. But hear me out. The concept of a tree is actually a tricky one, and there is no biological definition of a tree. So picture in your head a tree. Does it look like this oak? Yeah, probably something similar to that. I think we'd all agree that that oak is a tree. How about a spruce? Sure, definitely a tree. What about this witch hazel? A little bit shrubby, has multiple stems, maybe only 10 or 15 feet tall. Is that a tree? What about palm trees? They definitely look like trees, but they're monocots. They don't technically produce wood. Is that a tree? How about this Joshua tree? Does that count as a tree? Another one of these sort of woody monocots. How about a saguaro cactus? It's sort of the shape of a tree, not really wood. Is that a tree? So you can see it's actually confusing, and it's not that easy. And there's still debate about how do we define a tree. Luckily, we had the global tree assessment to answer those questions for us. And so since we wanted to ensure that our work was aligning exactly with this big global tree assessment initiative, we just kind of copped out and used their definition of a tree, which I think actually made a lot of sense. So the global tree assessment definition of a tree is a woody plant with usually a single stem growing to a height of at least 2 meters, or if multi-stemmed, then at least one vertical stem 5 centimeters DBH. And you can get this definition and all of the details about what was included and what was not from this great paper that Emily Beach and the rest of the BGCI team published in 2017 in the Journal of Sustainable Forestry. This was also the paper that introduced that global tree search database and that first checklist of global trees with about 60,000 species in it. And that list and database is dynamic and continues to grow and evolve as new things are described and things are synonymized. So that's a really great resource to turn to. But this is where we essentially pulled our definition of a tree. So the problem was that we didn't actually have a good database of trees that followed that definition of a tree. Now, there actually is no sort of one universally recognized checklist of US trees for the US. The trees can sort of be sourced from many different ways. These are three very commonly referenced checklists or tree floras in the US. The E.L. Little US Forest Service checklist of US trees from 1979, the BONAP program, and the USDA plants database. I'm sure many of you are familiar with one or all of these. And what you'll see is that all of these follow a slightly different definition of a tree, and there are also sort of various caveats and exceptions to some of these. For example, in USDA plants, that there may be short forms of some of these trees. You'll also see that the numbers are really different for what should be included and what should not when it comes to trees. Then we also know that we have the NatureServe Biotics database, which has a habit designation, and things get defined as a tree or not a tree there. Many of those tree definitions were basically just left up to whoever populated the database with whether or not something should be described as a tree. And sometimes plants were given the designation of tree and shrub. And then ultimately Global Tree Search pulled from all of these different sources and was probably not very up to date and was still sort of missing species, because most of these existing databases and lists, you know, would not necessarily have matched exactly the Global Tree Assessment definition of a tree. So we essentially looked at all of these different resources, created a master list, and went through and kind of filtered out based on the Global Tree Assessment, you know, checked taxonomy, looked at various different, you know, factors to try to figure out what our master list for the Global Tree Assessment would be. And that took a long time. In fact, it's still ongoing, and people still disagree with us, and you probably will too. So the results of our work so far, all of this, and let me draw attention to all of the results I'm going to present now are going to be published within the next probably 2 weeks in an article for a special issue of the journal Plants, People, Planet, and the special issue is focusing on the Global Tree Assessment. So our paper is in this along with about 10 other publications with other specialist groups and other sort of geographic regions, places like Brazil, Colombia, Malaysia. They're all sort of publishing their kind of national or regional tree assessments. So this is a really exciting time for trees, and I would encourage you to look that up. I have some more information about that at the end of the talk, but everything I'm about to present now will shortly be available. This is sort of hot on the press, as it were, not quite yet off the press. So the probably most useful, hopefully, resource from all of this work is this checklist that we've created. And we've added all of the data fields for all the additional work that we did. So in this publication, as a piece of supplementary information, and then on the Morton Arboretum website, we will have this sort of checklist. It's essentially a database of US trees. And the data fields that it includes are the family, the genus, and the specific epithet for each species, the taxonomic authority, the country level and state level distribution of that species, whether or not it's endemic to the contiguous US. Then we'll also include the IUCN Red List and NatureServe status and the year that they were most recently assessed or reviewed. We also have whether or not the species is listed under the Endangered Species Act. And we have the number of ex situ collections or sort of botanic gardens or seed banks where this species is growing. And we also include a tab of the species that we did not include in the checklist. And those were largely for the ones that sort of nearly made it but didn't, for reasons of taxonomy, or whether it just wasn't native or it wasn't a tree. It just sort of didn't qualify for our definition. So all of that information will be available. It's very user-friendly. It's a spreadsheet. You'll be able to download it. You can mess with it. You can look at what's in your state. You can sort it by different threat levels or, you know, the assessment framework, or however you want to mess around with it. We encourage you to do so. So what did we find? Let's start with the checklist. Our checklist of trees that qualify for this Global Tree Assessment definition includes 79 families, 269 genera, and 881 species of tree native to the contiguous 48 United States. 294 of those species are endemic to the contiguous United States. the genus Quercus, the oaks, which includes 85 native species, and contiguous with 84 species dominate the tree flora. Those were the genera with by far the most number of tree species in the US. 9 other genera have more than 10 tree species, but the next most common one I think was in the 40s in terms of numbers of trees. All of this stuff's going to be in the paper, and I have tables for it too. Geographically, our trees are distributed in some pretty clear tree hotspots. So our map on the left is all native trees in the contiguous US. The map on the right is the ones that are endemic tree species to the contiguous 48 states. And on the native tree side, so this is by state, so number of species by state. So for native trees, you can see that Texas and Florida are states with the highest number of native tree species, with over 300 trees in each of those states. California and the Southeast are also tree hotspots. Similar pattern for endemic trees. Georgia leads with over 150 species, and again, California, Texas, and the Southeast are where we have most of our endemic tree species. Now let's move into what the threat assessment results looked like for this project. So, reminder that we started this in 2017. Since then, we have created or updated 563 species of US tree for the IUCN Red List. And that was a 3-fold increase over the number of species that were on the Red List before we started. For NatureServe, and remember that that was very well represented for trees, just many of them were out of date. We created or updated, so mostly updated, 109 species assessments for NatureServe. And I'm pleased to report that there are now over 96% of the US tree species have been assessed on both of these threat assessment platforms in the US. The other development that we were able to do with this project was to create a crosswalk methodology that facilitated the bulk import of data from mostly just in one direction, because NatureServe had the more up-to-date information from NatureServe to the IUCN Red List through an SIS Connect process. And this was really helpful for doing, especially some of the more common species, but that were just missing on the Red List. This really helps to kind of streamline that process. And the tool for this essentially is sort of a series of access databases and sort of field alignments between NatureServe and the Red List. And this, if any of you are working on other plant species or even animal species, we'll allow it. You could go ahead and reach out to me or to our NatureServe partners, and we would love to work with you to get more of our US plant and animal species even into the IUCN Red List through this mechanism. So hopefully this crosswalk methodology can be used for other projects in the future. So what were the results of all those threat assessments and that we did? This is a lot of numbers, and I realize that, but I'll highlight the key take-home points for this. So as a reminder, our Red List categories are here on the left. The NatureServe categories are on the right, and a reminder that, again, they're not exact alignments between these rows. So the important thing to note here is what are threatened. So according to the IUCN Red List, 94 species native to the contiguous US are threatened with extinction. It's about 11% of that 881 total. For NatureServe, 135 species are classified as at risk. So in these possibly extinct, critically imperiled, imperiled, and vulnerable categories, or about 16% of our US native trees. Now, I mentioned that there is an exact alignment between these two platforms. So the other thing we did was for all of our 881 species, we took a look to see, are they listed as threatened or at risk on either of these platforms? And if you look at that, there are actually 165 species that appear in either the threatened or the at-risk category on one or both of these platforms. So there's some overlap, and then there are some species where they might, just be vulnerable on the red list, but they're a G4, for example, on NatureServe. So for most of the rest of the results I'm going to show from here out, I'm using this threatened and or at risk data set. So using this 165 species. And this is sort of to take a, I guess, excessively precautionary approach to this to make sure that we're, if there's any species that has been flagged on either platform, we're kind of we're capturing that in this analysis. So this is a breakdown of the families that have the most threatened and or at-risk species. And we quantified here the number of species that are threatened or at risk and compared that to the total number of native tree species that this family has in the US. And we were able to calculate the percent of the family that's threatened or at risk. And Rosaceae and Fagaceae, which is not surprising because that can and Quercus, the oaks, have the highest number of species that are threatened or at risk, with 34 and 19. Other families that are, the other families that are listed here are sort of the next highest numbers of threatened or at-risk species: Cupressaceae, Pinaceae, Oleaceae, Ericaceae, and Rhamnaceae. And if you look at the entire data set for the whole list, 40 of the 79 tree families have at least one threatened and or at-risk species in the US. We drill down a little deeper and look at the genus level. And the genera with the most threatened and or at-risk species are contiguous and Quercus, the hawthorns and the oaks, with 29 and 17 species respectively, out of their overall 84 and 85 species. The ash, the pines, Arctostaphylos, and Cupressus are other have other high numbers of threatened species. And in total, 77 of the 269 tree genera in the US have at least one threatened and or at-risk species. And many of the genera, even ones that have more than one tree species, many of them are 100% threatened. And again, these tables are all available in the paper when it comes out in a couple of weeks. We also looked at the most common threats facing US trees. And this graph was pulled only from the IUCN Red List data because we had better representation of the threat codes for that data set than from NatureServe. So this is a graph showing the number of species on the x-axis that had been identified as these threat categories applied to them. So each species can have more than one of these different threat categories. And this is a standardized threat sort of nomenclature system that IUCN uses. Threatened species, anything that's classified in a threatened category for IUCN has to have one of these threat codes. So the red bars on here, which are the threatened species, are going to be a pretty accurate representation of threats. The blue bars are not threatened species, so either near threatened or least concern or data deficient. Those not threatened species, they may sometimes be coded for their threat, but they don't always get coded for their threat. Some people, if it's least concern, they sort of skip that part because it's not required. So that's sort of a maybe not exhaustive representation of threat for not threatened species. But the red bars, the threatened species, should be pretty accurate. And what you can see is that invasive and other problematic species, genes, and diseases is the most common threat facing US trees. So that's things like emerald ash borer. It can also be where you have a species that's sort of being genetically swamped by something. If it's a very rare species and it's hybridizing and it's sort of getting essentially pushed out through hybridization, that might also be categorized here. For threatened species, natural system modifications such as fire regime change, biological resource use such as logging, and agriculture and aquaculture are other big threats. So is climate change and severe weather. So these are just some of the things that we know are causing problems for our US tree species. We then created those heat maps again, but this time for the threatened and or at-risk trees. So these are similar to the previous maps that you saw for sort of the tree hotspots. These are threatened tree hotspots in the US by state. On the left are our native threatened trees. So the number of native threatened and or at-risk tree species is highest in California and Florida, with Georgia in the Southeast and Texas also similar patterns. Florida and California each have 40 or more threatened native species. We then looked at the species that were endemic to the contiguous US and also threatened. And similar pattern as before, Georgia has the most threatened endemic species with 30, but also California, Texas, the Southeast are other threatened tree hotspots. We then took a look at whether or not our trees were represented in ex situ collections. And in order to do this, we leveraged the BGCI database known as Plant Search. And this is a really powerful tool. It's basically the best well-represented database of plants in cultivation. And it's mostly represented by Botanic Garden collections, but there are some seed banks and gene banks in there too. So this, the way that to read this graph is the number of species in each of these sort of categories is on the number of species on the x-axis, and then however many ex situ collections. So you can sort of interpret that as meaning the number of botanic gardens or seed banks that it is held in. So if you start at the bottom of this graph, we have over 25 native US tree species that are represented in more than 200 ex situ collections, more than 200 botanic gardens. This may be global too, it's not just in the US. But what you'll see is that most of those are the not threatened species. So blue bars are not threatened, red sections of the bars are the threatened or at-risk species. And what you can see is that the species that are not threatened are more likely to be held in many, many collections, right? 20, 50, 100, 200, even 300 botanic garden collections. The red bars are the species that are threatened or at risk, and those are more concentrated in many fewer collections. And what I'd like to now look at in a little bit more detail is that 0 bar at the top. So that top bar is those tree species in the U.S. that are not represented anywhere in ex situ collections. These are the 17 threatened and or at-risk tree species that are not held anywhere in a botanic garden collection, which means that these things are, at risk of extinction, and we do not have them backed up in a collection. We have no insurance policy against extinction for these tree species. And I think this is a really important point to highlight how important it is for conservation practitioners to partner with public gardens and arboreta, especially because of the importance of having, a sort of integrated conservation approach that includes both in situ conservation as well as ex situ conservation. And I'd like to draw your attention to ArbNet as a potential partner for you in this work. ArbNet is the global interactive community of arboreta that the Morton Arboretum coordinates. And on the ArbNet website, which you can look at arbnet.org, we have the Morton Register of Arboreta, and you can sort it by state, by country, and by state. And so you can find out where your nearest arboretum is. And if you are familiar with any of these species in the wild, please partner with an arboretum or a public garden near you to ensure that these trees are conserved and sort of backed up in these collections, whether they be seed banks or living collections. I also want to draw your attention to the 3 oak species on this list, the Quercus species. Oaks can't be seed banked. They're what we call exceptional species. Their acorns don't survive the cold and dehydration, largely, conditions of a conventional seed bank. And so if you are familiar with any of these oak species, I would encourage you, or oaks in general, I would encourage you to join another program that we have, which is the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak. And this is a pretty broad-reaching collective coalition of experts and organizations interested in conserving oaks around the world. But one of the big focuses of the Global Conservation Consortia is exceptional species. So creating a network of especially living collections or meta collections, coordinated living collections, to ensure that these species are backed up in essentially living gene banks, because we do not have the seed bank tool at our disposal. It's not in our sort of conservation toolkit. And another thing I just want to point out while we're on this slide is, if any of you have noticed or caught in the news lately, one of our GCCO projects that has had a really exciting recent development is Quercus tardifolia, that last oak on the list, which was thought to be extinct about 10 years ago. We think the last tree died in Big Bend National Park down in Texas. A GCCO coalition, a big coalition, an expedition of 10 that included 10 different organizations, including NatureServe and the Morton Arboretum and a bunch of other agencies and national parks. We rediscovered Quercus tardifolia in Big Bend, and we now have found one tree. And so hopefully we will be able to do some vegetative propagation and get that species back into Botanic Gardens so that we can knock this list down. So I'd love to hear if you're aware of any of these species and collections. We would love to update Plant Search to reflect that data, but this could be a good area of focus. And then finally, we took a look at the Endangered Species Act and compared that to our checklist of 881 trees, and 8 U.S. tree species have received federal protections under the Endangered Species Act. And again, if we compare that to our Red List threatened species and our NatureServe at-risk species, it's clear that it's really important that we have our agencies, our conservation NGOs, our boots on the ground conservation practitioners putting effort into some of these species, because they're not currently getting federal protection. So wake up, time to talk about conclusions and key messages. So what did we cover today? We understand that there's going to be disagreements around whether or not something's a tree. There's always taxonomic disputes about whether something's a species or a subspecies or variety. Nativity to a region we've even had issues with. So I wouldn't get too bogged down in those details. I think the point of this talk is to focus on the big trends and themes. And that's that about 11 to 16% of our US tree species in the contiguous United States are threatened with extinction. Oaks and hawthorns are our most species-rich tree groups, and they are also our most threatened tree groups by numbers. Texas, California, and the southeastern US have the most tree species as well as the most threatened tree species. Invasive pests and diseases, climate change, biological resource use such as logging, and natural system modification are the biggest threats to US trees. 17 threatened or at-risk tree species are not protected currently in any ex situ collection and are really at risk of extinction. And only 8 tree species are federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. So what can we do? How do we take action? There's a lot we can do. First of all, we can all be supporting the threat assessment process for taxa in your region. So if you have any information, I would encourage everybody, if there's species you're concerned about, if there's tree species you're thinking about, go on the NatureServe Explorer website, go to IUCNRedList.org and take a look and see if your favorite tree is assessed. How recently was it assessed? Do you agree with the assessment? Do you think it's missing information? Can you improve it? We still have a lot of data deficient species, and there are still some of those out of date species. And we also didn't assess any infrataxa. We sort of constrained this project to species level, but we totally recognize there are a whole lot of infrataxa out there that are probably more rare and definitely need to be assessed. And you can do that for both the Red List and for NatureServe. You can assess at like the subspecies or variety level. We also encourage you to utilize the data crosswalk that we developed with for other plant species, non-trees, for example. You could even do it for animals. And it works, especially if you see that there's up-to-date information in NatureServe, but that it's not assessed or it's super out of date on the Red List. That's probably the best way to use it. Partner with your local botanic garden or arboretum to ensure that the threatened species from your region are conserved in ex situ collections as an insurance policy against extinction. prioritize threatened tree hotspots, like those states and regions we talked about, and the taxonomic groups that we highlighted for coordinated action to maximize our limited conservation resources. And ensure that threatened and at-risk tree species are a focus of your habitat restoration, seed collection, and reforestation efforts. And then for more information, I would encourage you to check out this Plants, People, Planet special issue that's upcoming. There are already a couple early access articles that are available on the Plants, People, Planet website. This QR code will take you right to Plants, People, Planet, but you can also just Google it. And like the Magnolia group, I think already got their paper out in early online access, and there's about 10 other articles that I'm aware of that will be coming down the pipeline in the next couple of months. Again, our paper should be published within the next 2 weeks, and all of these data sets are going to be available, and they'll also be on the Morton Arboretum website. I would also encourage you to check out the State of the World's Trees report, which was published by BGCI in 2020, and it was a sort of check-in of how the GTA has been going through from 2015 through 2020, and it's very exciting. They got, nearly all of those 60,000 tree species some level of threat assessment or conservation status assessment, but they're not all standardized yet. So the next goal, the next sort of milestone for the global tree assessment is to have all of the world's 60,000 tree species, it's actually more like 58,500, assessed on the IUCN Red List by 2025. So there is still work to do. We are still seeking partners. If you are interested, please let me know. And I would be very happy to answer any questions and have a bit of discussion.
Thanks, Murphy. Oh, great timing here with the phone.
Carol, would you like me to start with the chat or open questions up for the chat?
I do have a couple questions.
Okay, great.
So I was thinking about mesquite species and wondering if they fit the definition of a tree very easily.
I can take a look. Which species were you curious about?
Oh, well, I guess the three most common ones. And then, of course, now I can't think of them. All I can think of is screwbean, Juliflora. But I know there's two.
Is it taller than 2 meters?
Yeah, it is.
We were pretty inclusive. So yeah. The way that we kind of defined our tree was if it may be sort of like the shrub was really the shrub to tree threshold was the biggest challenge. If there were, and it also needed to be a tree in the contiguous United States. There are some species that are trees, in more sort of tropical areas, and they get a little shrubbier as they get into the contiguous United States. So it's sort of it's an art, maybe not a science. But our complete list of all 881 species is well, it's not available yet. It's going to be available in 2 weeks once we publish this, and you can take a look and see. And if anybody thinks there should be a tree on there that isn't, Global Tree Search is where we have now aligned that tree list to, and feedback can be sent directly to Global Tree Search. There's information for how to do that in the paper, and we can add or remove species. We can change endemicity if there's disagreement about that. So that's a dynamic database that we've sort of worked to align and create, and now Global Tree Search will essentially maintain that.
So do have a second question, and that's about hybrids. Because I know a lot of the oaks hybridize. And NatureServe has a category where they just call things hybrid. I'm wondering if the IUCN Red List has anything like that.
Yeah, so they have a taxonomic vetting process and essentially a taxonomic backbone that IUCN uses. They do not recognize hybrids, so you can't assess a hybrid on IUCN Red List. Hybrids exist in the biotics database, and as you said, are annotated or recognized as a hybrid. So we excluded hybrids from this list. In some cases, there is debate about whether or not something's a hybrid. In fact, Quercus tardifolia, our next step on that is to do the genetic analysis now that we have material from a tree that we think still exists and is that concept, Quercus tardifolia. We're doing the genetic analysis to try to see, is it some sort of weird spontaneous hybrid? Is it its own sort of, segregating genetic entity? And so that's sort of the next question there. So long-winded answer to say, no, we did not include hybrids.
Okay, and then my last question would be, are there efforts to collect geospatial data for the ranges of these trees, especially the rare ones? And I'm also thinking of the crop wild relative trees.
Yes, not as part of this project. So this project was largely like essentially lit review and expert consultation. So the Red List assessment process, we didn't go out surveying for any of these things. It was very much like, looking at the literature, looking at floras, looking at gray literature, recent publications, recent field survey reports, talking to the state, botanist or the natural heritage programs in the state to say, okay, tell us everything you know about this particular species. And that's how we compiled these assessments. So we do need occurrence data for the assessments. We got that largely from GBIF, from the NatureServe, the natural heritage data sets, from from experts in the field, confirming, rejecting occurrence points. Oh, that population doesn't exist anymore, that kind of thing. So improving the distribution level information is for sure something that we need to do. It's sort of a collective task we all have, is to make sure that we have up-to-date distribution information. It wasn't a primary focus of this project.
Okay, thanks. Other questions from other people out there? Yeah, Judy.
Hello, great presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to have a follow-up question on what you just said. So you pulled together a lot of data to do these assessments. I'm curious, are you storing those data publicly or sharing them with IUCN?
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's such a great question. I can't believe I didn't say that sooner. So let's clarify that. So yes, all of our assessment data so the Morton Arboretum, when I say we largely led the Red List side of things. So all of our assessments are published on IUCN. You can go to IUCNredlist.org. There's going to be an update on July 22nd, which will include 40 or 50 additional species of ours. And then we have a whole nother set of probably 50 or 60 species that are in the publication queue for the last update of the year, which is going to be in December. At that point, the Red List should reflect what our report will say. So this is a little bit of it's kind of not best practice. Like the Red List is a little bit, they don't love it when we do this, but we just really wanted to push this out and get it out there. They're also so swamped right now with all these tree assessments coming through. So yeah, everything is going into the Red List. So we don't actually hold any proprietary information. Our checklist is now going to be on our website and on that PPP supplementary material, and all of our Red List information will be fully accessible through the IUCN Red List portal. NatureServe, everything that's updated there is going to be in NatureServe Explorer, which is also openly accessible, and all of that information is there. So yes, great question. I should have clarified that. There's a bit of a lag because of these publication updates. They happen about every 4 to 6 months for the Red List. But by the end of 2022, everything, all the stats we're showing here should be reflected by fully updated assessments on the Red List website.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, Murphy. Fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
This isn't so much of a question, but I'm looking in the chat and it looks like Jenna Lewinson said that she's looking for an expert to talk to about what is known about masting species, masting events, and climate variables associated with masting. And so I guess just on her behalf, I'm wondering, is there somewhere that she can go to find someone who, you know, specializes in that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I focus a lot on oaks, which mast. And so my best context for that would be like acorn masting. And Ian Pierce, who I think is a USGS employee now, I think he's based in Colorado. Ian Pierce would be a really good point of reference to start with. He's done a lot of work on oak masting. And I don't have his email address off the top of my head, but let me put his name in here. Did that pop up for you? The chat is a little bit weird for me. It's like super delayed, so I'm not seeing everything.
Yes, I am seeing it.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
I don't know if anybody else is familiar with his work. I'm pretty sure he's with USGS now. Maybe we have some USGS people on the call, but that would be a good, he would be a good person to reach out to for, like, at least for oaks, for acorn masting.
Thank you for taking the time to answer my very specific question.
That's okay.
Because I was thinking about oaks, you know, being a masting species. So,
Yeah.
But yes,
Yeah,
I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, great.
I put Ian Pierce's contact information in the chat for you, by the way, Matthew.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Murphy. That was a really great presentation. Thanks. I may be in touch with you again to maybe give this talk in another place or two. So if
Sure.
you can do that, that would
Sure.
be
Happy
that would
to.
be great. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was
Yeah.
a really nice talk.
It was great, Murphy. And we'll share, when the paper comes out, we'll send it out to the PCA listserv as well.
That's a great idea. Yes, let's do that, Ray. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions through email or chat offline. Yeah, and thanks everyone for your interest. I hope this can be useful.